are standing by with those crucial exit poll figures. Here they are. Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority of 86, and that will be the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher's third victory back in 1987.
And if these numbers are broadly correct, Boris Johnson may just have redrawn the map.
If this poll is anywhere near right, you've produced your worst result since 1935.
Yeah, if it is anywhere near right, that's right.
So the boxes coming in Sunderland at a pace. Look at that.
Now, what our map does show you very clearly is the Red Wall. I'll walk you along the Red Wall. This is through northwest England into Yorkshire. How much will this wall crumble tonight? Well,
in 1989, Russia's Berlin Wall came down. In 2019, Labour's Red Wall came down.
You know, this has been a hard-fought general election campaign at a cold time of the year as well. We've all been out on the road. We've had amazing candidates day in, day out, taking that message out across the country that we need to break the gridlock.
I was determined in this election we would use our influence to stop a second referendum.
Can I just go to Newcastle and have a look at what's going on there? Newcastle upon Tyne Central.
I am the first MP to be declared. So for the moment, the entire British Parliament is Labour.
I'd like to make the declaration of the result of poll for the Blythe Valley constituency. Ian Levy, the Conservative Party candidate, 17,000.
This is one of the big moments of the night. There's no question about it at all.
I would like to thank Boris, because I'm going to be on that train on Monday. I'm going to London. We're going to get Brexit done.
You know, this is a symbolic moment in this night.
The exit poll forecast that the Conservatives would narrowly win Blythe Valley.
This could build a new Conservative majority across Britain for another generation.
Well, there you have it. I'm sorry, we should have issued a trigger warning for UK leftists revisiting that material from the 2019 election. Welcome to the Popular Show in the morning with me, James A. Smith, and I'm thrilled to be joined by Phil Burton-Cartledge. He's the author of Falling Down, the Conservative Party and the Decline of Tory Britain, published by Verso Books. We're going to be trying to make sense of the resignation of the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Phil, thanks for joining us on the Popular Show.
Morning, James.
How are you?
All good, cheers. Though, you know, the trigger warning was definitely necessary because I almost put my foot through the television when that was announced at the time. I'm sure we all have horror stories from that particular moment.
Yeah. When the exit poll came out, I was actually changing trains on my way back to Manchester. So there was just this sort of moment where I wasn't around anyone I knew, and I just checked my phone and saw it, and just sort of stood there alone as it all kind of washed over me. The collapse and the crushing of Britain's left populist experiment under Jeremy Corbyn, and a historic victory by Boris Johnson, where he managed to get support for the Conservative Party in parts of Britain that had never supported it before. That was 2.5 years ago. We flash forward, and the same guy, the guy who that night everything was being attributed to, has had to resign, as indeed his two predecessors did. This is the third consecutive Prime Minister, the third consecutive Conservative Prime Minister, who, despite increasing the support that the party had in the country, has had to resign midway through. When your book came out, and also when you were talking about it coming out, what was it? It came out 2021. Came out last year,
September.
This part of the thesis that it's the decline of Tory Britain that you were writing about seemed rather eccentric. Do you feel vindicated this week?
Yes, and I remember someone writing a review in a magazine at the time saying that this was just full of wishful thinking. But no, I don't want to. You can't think about it in terms of kind of the iron laws of history grinding out or grinding down the Conservative Party. Rather, it's a tendency, and the fact that the the Tory party's base is something that's in long-term decline, it means that crises in the Conservative Party are inevitable. And just when I knew that when Boris Johnson was elected, that even though it looked like that this was a position of strength, we had Nicholas Soames talking about a new Conservative coalition that would last a generation.
The grandson of Winston Churchill, incidentally.
Indeed, yes. Even then, I wasn't convinced. I thought that the Conservatives were still in big trouble. All that Boris Johnson had managed to do was maximise out that potential Tory coalition, and it was all downhill from there.
So for viewers, this is going out on Doug Lane's Sublation Media channel, which is mainly watched by American leftists. So we say hi to you guys, like and subscribe, and also click on the link below to get over to our own YouTube channel where we're posting a lot of stuff. We just started that, so we'd love to have you as a subscriber over there too. We want to kind of explain what's going on in Britain for that kind of wider audience. And really, this isn't just a local news story. The Conservative Party is the most successful electoral party in the world. And what happens to it does kind of have lessons for the right and the shape of the right internationally, and also lessons for how the international left responds, really. So I think it's kind of important that we get to grips with this. Can you kind of get a little deeper into that kind of claim that the right appears to be so powerful right now, but actually there is a kind of, well, as you just said, it's downhill from here. Maybe you could kind of get into that thesis a little bit more for us.
Yeah, sure. It's quite basic, really. The fact that Conservative Party and right-wing parties generally tend to be more dependent on older voters. Now, William Hague, former Conservative Party leader, was asked about this a number of years ago. It was about 2 or 3 years ago. And he said, this is something that the Conservative Party and the right don't have to worry about because there'll always be plenty of old people. My argument is that even though they are dependent on old people, and of course old people have a tendency to, sadly, pass away, that this coalition that they've built around old people, and particularly propertied old people at the centre, is not replacing itself. So you just have to look in Britain, you also look in the United States as well, how the drivers of conservatism, i.e. property ownership, home ownership, is breaking down, that fewer and fewer people of working age are able to get on the housing ladder. And if they're unable to get on the housing ladder, that means they are locked out of property ownership, and therefore they're locked out of a tendency to vote Conservative, particularly in later life. So what we're seeing now is the fruits, if you like, of the Thatcherite revolution in housing in the 1980s. For those who don't necessarily know what Margaret Thatcher did, we had social housing, which was also known as council housing in the UK, which was sold off to tenants quite cheaply during the 1980s, creating a new class of homeowners that were previously would never have been able to get onto the housing ladder. Furthermore, in the early to mid 1980s as well, cheap credit and cheap mortgages became readily available as well. So it was quite easy for people who would be ordinarily low paid to get on the housing ladder. And unlike the foreclosure crisis that we had in the United States in the mid to late noughties, that these people were able to keep up their mortgage payments until the late 1980s anyway. And this was a conscious strategy on the part of the Conservatives. They wanted to break up the solidarities, or communities of solidarity, i.e. labour movements, working class communities that worked in a relatively cohesive way and returned Labour Party politicians at election time, and try to individuate people and get them to think more along the lines of mini capitalists as people who are interested in maximising their property portfolio or their share portfolio, because also in the 1980s, this was a particular period in which the Thatcher government pursued what we might call popular privatisations, though they were never as popular as history would have you believe. But nevertheless, millions of people took up shares in British Telecom, in British Gas, in the privatised utilities companies, water and electricity, and so on. It helped create a class or a strata of small, petty shareholders. And the idea was to expand the electorate for the Conservative Party. Whisk forward until to the 2010s, you start to see that whilst these people, as they've aged, they've held on to their property, because, thanks to deliberate policies by subsequent governments to Thatcher, there has not been building of enough social housing or enough private housing, for that matter, which meant that the property values, asset prices have inflated, making many pensioners, particularly those in the southeast of England, on paper millionaires. And this is the key driver, and understanding this is the key driver for Conservative Party support. And it's also understanding this is key to understanding how that vote is beginning to decompose.
So, having instigated this neoliberal transition, this atomization, this turning of a population into everybody being a kind of small business unto themselves, the party of the right in Britain, much like the Republican Party in the US, has actually succeeded in recent times by changing the tape and rebranding as the most vociferous critic of precisely those tendencies. Trump was so successful because he seemed to be able to offer a kind of economic populist antidote to precisely the processes that you're describing. And Boris Johnson was much the same. Nigel Farage said, when shown how economically damaging Brexit could be, said that some things are more important than money. Boris Johnson, very similarly, when shown, the way that businesses were complaining about Brexit, said, "Fuck business." The capitalist parties have managed to kind of rebrand as kind of pseudo anti-capitalists for the moment. How has that played out since Boris Johnson won that big majority in 2019? How, if that was part of the kind of rhetoric that allowed him to win then and to take so much of the left vote, how has that played out in government?
It's what you call political vaporware, basically, because Johnson has made a great deal about so-called levelling up. This is the idea that for many areas of the country outside of London, they've been left behind over the course of the last 40 years. You had deindustrialisation in the 1980s, which was accelerated by Thatcherism and also accelerated under Tony Blair as well, lest we forget. And so there's a sense that places where I live, Stoke-on-Trent, which is in the West Midlands, is a former industrial town that used to be home of the potteries, but also steelworks and the mines. And the idea that nothing has come in to replace those industries. And so these towns, these cities have just been left to go to seed. And so Johnson's argument is, which is borrowed from Theresa May, his predecessor, this idea of spreading prosperity by using the agency of the state to invest. So this is kind of language that you might have expected from the Labour Party at some point in time, pre-Jeremy Corbyn. However, none of this has materialised. He's made a great deal of sound and fury around investing in localities, but in practice, we're talking chicken feed. So, for example, here in Stoke-on-Trent, since 2010, since the Conservatives came to power, over £120 million has been cut from the local government grant that goes to the local authority. The local authority would use that to provide services, would use it to fund regeneration projects and all the rest of it. Under the Levelling Up Fund, the monies that have come in are not even 10% of that. So we're not replacing like for like. And part of the problem with this is that Johnson is or was caught between the tensions within his coalition, because it's not just pensioners who have an interest in rising asset prices, but also a lot of the institutional investors that support the Conservatives also have an interest in rising asset prices. You think about the institutional landlords, the big property speculators. None of these people have an interest in levelling up, because ultimately any kind of levelling up strategy would require a mass house building programme all across the UK. And of course, if you suddenly increase the supply and meet demand, then the prices asked start coming down, which of course is not in the interest of these institutional investors. And so this is why the kind of character that levelling up has taken tends to be tinkering around the edges. So if you were to come to Stoke-on-Trent today, for example, and were to compare it to 10 years ago, you would find that the local park looks very nice after a period of decline. You'll find that some of the more historic buildings around the town have been spruced up and so look pleasant again and approach something of their Victorian heyday. And also the local Conservative council have spent millions on taking a Spitfire and putting it in a fish tank, effectively. So when you walk by, you can look at a Spitfire on the way to the local library, whose opening hours have been cut. So all these kinds of little things, they are kind of showy. People can see that there's been tangible change, but it's very superficial change. Behind it, the social infrastructure, people's living standards, the numbers of homeless people, for example, in this city have exploded and more visible than ever before. Now, these are the things that the Tories are their levelling up has kind of helped fund some baubles, but have only really papered over the cracks of the really deep-seated problems that they're sitting on.
A Spitfire in a fish tank feels somehow symbolic of the
Stoke-on-Trent, you can see yourselves.
And a lot of people have been very disappointed, actually, with Boris Johnson on those grounds. I think one of the best reactions to Boris's resignation was actually from the right, from Aris Racinos in Unheard. He wrote that no one in living memory can have squandered such a far-reaching and revolutionary mandate for reform through such petty and absurd personal failings. In all the long litany of failures he now drags around behind him, this is the bitterest draught for his voters, for us to swallow, that there is nothing to show for any of it. And I've got to say, I do sympathise with that. Watching back that footage from the 2019 election is painful. It was painful for everyone on our side. And I suspect, Phil, that you might feel the same as me, that really nothing has gone well for us since then. And yet, well, put it this way, if you have a kind of tough breakup with somebody and you hear that they're with someone else and they're thriving, they're out all the time, it's a great relationship, it's painful, but on some level you can feel like it was meant to be. If you have a terrible breakup and then they're with someone else and that relationship is also terrible, you sort of think, well, what the hell was all that for? And that's kind of how I feel about Boris Johnson and the country right now. He beat us, and he did so by promising to use the most successful party in the world and to use the British state to actually deliver on some of our aims. That was the level on which Jeremy Corbyn was sort of right about having won the argument, however much cope there was in that statement. And yet there's nothing to show for it. 2.5 years of the most revolutionary mandate and far-reaching mandate, and he's done nothing. I mean, your predecessor in writing a book on the decline of the Tory party, Geoffrey Wheatcroft, who wrote another book that's actually very interesting, The Strange Death of Tory England. He argued in 2005, when David Cameron took over the Tory party, Cameron representing himself as the heir to Blair, Wheatcroft said that what Britain really needs is a not the Tony Blair party. And despite the fact that Boris Johnson, like Trump, has been the sort of very model of unacceptable populism that mainstream centrists love to hate, actually, it's possible to see him as not having departed from that blueprint at all. When we had Jake Berry, MP, on the show about a year ago, and he said that Boris isn't a populist at all. He wants to be Tony Blair. Is there a way in which actually this kind of massive failure of an administration is not totally reducible to Boris Johnson's obvious personal failings, but rather speaks to a kind of stuckness in British politics as such?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, as I've kind of just said, Johnson was really a prisoner of the tensions within the Tory coalition. The Tory modernisation project of levelling up is stymied by the fact that they're dependent on institutional and financial interests who do not have an interest in making sure that there's a ready housing supply, for example. But also, you've got to remember as well, when you look back to that 2019 manifesto of Boris Johnson's, it was literally an incredibly thin document. I think it was about 40, 50 pages, something like that. It was called Just Get Brexit Done, which is what it was all about. And when you actually look in the content of it, because sadly I read that manifesto, I always read all the parties' manifestos, I'm afraid to say.
So you can really make up your mind, just to check.
Yeah, that's it. Just hope they can persuade me. No. There was nothing in there apart from, there was mentions about levelling up. There's a few promises that were kind of red meat for the Tory faithful, such as a determination to beat down on the traveller community, for example. But there was very, very little. And the kind of counsel that Johnson received on Conservative Home, which is the main Tory grassroots website here in the UK, from key figures in the party was, okay, you've won this mandate, so let's not actually do anything with it. To keep the red wall, i.e. those working class former Labour voters who are mostly pensionable age but had spent most of their lives voting Labour but went Tory in 2019, their idea for keeping them on side was actually don't do anything, because they're not going to go to the Labour Party. Labour Party is too toxic as far as they're concerned, too socially liberal, too into LGBTQ rights, trans rights, and Black Lives Matter. They're too toxic. We just have to coast for the next 4 or 5 years and we'll win another thumping majority. And so the Tories weren't really set up to do anything. So you've got a kind of a mix of them not really promising anything, at least when you look at the kind of into the fine print. You've got that combination of institutional interests that don't want them to do anything. And also you've got to look at the Tory party in Parliament as well. There's probably more Thatcherites in the Parliamentary Conservative Party now than there were during Thatcher's day. And their first instinct is low tax, which means small state, which means a state that can't do anything. And also the so-called, what they call being the party of hard work, i.e. cutting social security even further. So wages can be driven down even more. And their first instinct is that the state doesn't know what it's doing. The state invariably acts in interests that aren't their interests, i.e. business interests, and therefore they are opposed to it doing anything at all. I mean, I was just reading some of the comments that have come out on Conservative Home this morning, and people were declaring Rishi Sunak on there, who is a hard right Thatcherite, as one of the leading contenders to be the next Conservative leader and therefore Prime Minister. He was being described as a socialist, even though I just think this is utterly crazy because he oversaw the furlough scheme during the acute phase of the COVID pandemic. So, it's the contradictions within the Tory party itself have really kind of stymied Boris Johnson. And to be honest, also, there is Boris Johnson's personality as well, and he is an incredibly lazy person. I don't think he's that bothered, really. He's interested in the plaudits, and he thinks things should be done for him. But for him, it's just a case of saying, do this, do that. He doesn't kind of get a sense of having to struggle for anything, despite the fact of winning a thumping majority in an election. That, again, was on the back of a divided opposition and a electoral system plus a newspaper establishment which sets the tone for broadcast news in this country that was all pro-Conservative, pro-Boris Johnson. So, yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think they failed, and will also continue to fail under whoever is appointed the next Conservative Prime Minister.
I think that there are a few sort of angles from which this is very hard to celebrate, even though obviously people on the left in Britain pretty much despise Boris Johnson. It's hard to celebrate because of what we're going to get into in a moment, the prospects for a successor hardly being inspiring. It's hard to celebrate because really we've seen an amazing experiment in what happens when you give somebody who has an almost kind of utopian project. I think that the last decade has seen three utopias in Britain proposed: Brexit, Corbynism, and Scottish independence. And the Tory version of Brexit is the one that so far came to the surface. And then you give a guy basically unlimited power and an unlimited mandate to see it through, and nothing happens. We essentially just have this kind of grim sameness for all that Liberals and the left in Britain denounced Boris Johnson's response to COVID. Essentially, you might criticise the local kind of rollout of it. It was the same as everywhere else. Look at Ukraine. We match America in terms of the NATO line, the escalatory NATO line. But Boris Johnson is too similar, in my view, to a kind of standard prime minister, as opposed to too different. That's the problem with him. The other kind of angle for me, and I went into this on a video on our own YouTube channel, is that what we've seen with Boris Johnson is a kind of personal assassination, whether you think he deserves it or not, that actually has a lot of kinship with what was done to Jeremy Corbyn. That's the kind of irony of Boris Johnson's situation. He was, the political establishment didn't want him. And in 2016, immediately after the referendum, they did everything they could to avoid having Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But by 2019, and with the real kind of threat, and it was that, and all of these resignation letters have attested to the fact that Corbynism was regarded as a massive threat on the right, not a joke, as you would hear from most people in the Labour Party today. It was a real threat, and they got Boris Johnson in specifically to get rid of that threat, and most of the whole political spectrum coalesced one way or another around him in order to make that happen, in order to get rid of Corbyn. Well, they swallowed the spider to catch the fly, and then as many people attested, pretty much immediately they wanted rid of him, and that has been going on from the start. So this kind of drip feed of stories about parties in Downing Street, this just sudden kind of changing of how Boris Johnson gets spoken about in the media, it's all too familiar from how the kind of tone around Corbyn changed as soon as he showed in 2017 that he could actually be a credible threat to the establishment. So it's depressing to see, somebody given this huge power and huge mandate and not be able to do anything with it. And it's depressing to see how somebody's reputation and standing can be obliterated pretty much overnight. And that's the main thing I take away from it, really, myself. I don't know if you want to come back on that, but also maybe take us into what the kind of prospects for the next identity that the Conservative Party is likely to take as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do need to also remember what you might regard, or what some Conservatives might regard as Boris Johnson's achievements. Apart from getting Brexit done and therefore, reasserting the Conservative dominance of Parliament, that's the first achievement. But from the standpoint of capital as well, the fact that Johnson has clamped down hard on the right to protest and the right to dissent. We've seen some of the most authoritarian legislation go through Parliament. I mean, Johnson doesn't strike you as an authoritarian character, But look at some of the people who he's surrounded himself with, particularly Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, who is by far the most extreme Home Secretary we've ever had in this country. Looking at a situation where leaks of government documents in a bill that's before Parliament at the moment could get journalists 14 years in prison. You can be imprisoned for having a protest that is too loud. These are all things that have been overseen by Boris Johnson. And in that sense, Boris Johnson is a continuation of previous prime ministers, because since Margaret Thatcher, there has been this ramping up of authoritarianism, the authoritarianism of the state, the authoritarianism of the office of the prime minister, which also continued unabated under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown as well. So I think that's also an important point of continuity. And I don't think that we're going to see any difference from whoever Johnson's successor is in that regard. This repressive legislation that we're seeing is going to continue. We might see some changes. So, for example, one of the things that was announced under Johnson was the privatisation of Channel 4. So for listeners and viewers that don't know what Channel 4 is, it's one of the main public access television channels in the UK. It's also got a liberal left reputation, and over the years has kind of established itself as a trendsetter and a purveyor of programmes that really push at the envelope of what is considered acceptable conversation. So it struck blows for LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ visibility, for anti-racism and so on and so forth. And so the current plan is to privatise that. I think that is a plan that will probably see that will go the way of the dodo. But the rest of the things that are in Boris Johnson's in tray, so for example, he was about to announce big tax cuts this week if the coup hadn't derailed him. Those will probably still go ahead. But the rest of Boris Johnson's agenda, because it is so thin, anyone can just simply take it over and brand it as they see fit. And when you start looking at what the Conservative Party candidates or the leading candidates are starting to say in their pitches to their electorate, it's all kind of flim-flammery around low taxes, believing in hard work, restoring Britain to how it was. It's stuff that we've heard before. No one is saying. What's quite interesting is that when Theresa May took over from David Cameron in 2016, her immediate pitch was, and which caught a lot of people, and might have caught you a bit off guard as well, James, is when she started talking about social justice issues and the need to kind of tackle persistent inequalities in the UK. Interestingly, Boris Johnson never bothered taking over that language. He kind of sublimated some of it in his levelling up agenda, but he never really talked about inequality issues. And looking at the pictures of the people who are coming up now, none of them are talking about these issues either. In fact, many of them are using code words that suggest they want to continue the war on woke, the kind of thing that Trump specialised in. Boris Johnson and his lieutenants in the press have been happily pursuing this war on woke, and they're going to continue doing the same as well, because it's divisive, it helps divide up people, and they think it's one way of helping bring together that coalition that got them this huge majority in 2019, helping glue it back together by finding scapegoats, fulminating against the liberal elite, talking about immigrants. These sorts of things they think play really well to the country, and I can't see any successor to Boris Johnson abandoning them, even though they don't particularly.
So it feels like the future is either a candidate from the so-called liberal wing of the Conservative Party who will come in sort of wanting to return us to the austerity agenda of David Cameron, and will be coming in with an inheritance from Boris Johnson of a highly authoritarian tranche of policies for cracking down on any kind of resistance to that austerity agenda, and also a massive kind of increase in pro-war sentiments. David Cameron just couldn't wait to strap on the boots and and get to war. But there was a kind of problem of consent and a kind of hangover from Iraq. I think that what we've seen this year over Ukraine is a decimation of the legitimacy of the anti-war movement and any kind of criticism of NATO. And you can thank Sir Keir Starmer for quite a lot of that. So yeah, really, it could be David Cameron, with the gloves off, if it's a Guardian-approved so-called liberal Tory, or we turn to the right of the Conservative Party, and there we do have a kind of interesting way in which that fiscal responsibility has been dropped from the language a bit, but it's mainly taking the form of wanting to copy Trump on tax cuts, as far as I can tell, and with a kind of to my mind, a misreading of Brexit as a culture war issue, as opposed to what I described it before as a utopian kind of desire to really transform how sovereignty, legitimacy, and economy works in the country. So wherever you turn in that party, you're looking at a kind of something that's even worse than Boris Johnson, as far as I can tell. That's likely to be more competent and have more consent across the media. At least Boris Johnson was divisive. People complain about being divisive, but you don't want everyone agreeing in defense of the leader, right? From all these angles, there is not much to celebrate at all. With Boris Johnson handing the baton to one of the other kind of demons in that party.
Yeah, it's difficult to see who's going to actually win at the moment, because when you've looked at all the polls that have been done on Conservative Home, for example, Ben Wallace, the current Defence Secretary, who's been very hawkish over Ukraine, he is someone who has consistently led the polls, but we're only talking by 2 percentage points. He's usually listed on being something like 16%. And we have Penny Mordaunt, who is a junior minister in Johnson's government, who has military associations. She's on something like 14-15%. And you have Liz Truss, 13%. And it just goes down and down like that, just by 1%. So there's no real clear front runner. And so we've got to think, if they do go for someone like Liz Truss, for example, who is the current Foreign Secretary, she's quite, very similar to Boris Johnson in her politics. She's very much a Marmite character, very, very definitely divisive as well. And it depends what kind of mood the Tory grassroots are in as well, because ultimately, Tory grassroots always choose the candidate they think is going to win. But the problem that the Tory grassroots have got is because they've been effectively radicalised over the last, since Brexit, since the referendum in 2016, and they've been radicalised in a right-wing populist direction, which has also been aided by an influx of members or former members from the UK Independence Party and then supporters of the Brexit Party, which is what UKIP became effectively. Is that, do they think that having someone like Liz Truss, who is, pretty, for want of a better phrase, is pretty demented, is, hardliner on all issues, believer in war on woke stuff and all the rest of it, do they really think that someone like that can win an election? And I think that a large proportion of the membership do think like that, rather than going for someone who's a bit more centrist, like, for example, Rishi Sunak, who is, relatively hard Thatcherite, but seems to be socially liberal on a number of issues. If you like, a Brexity David Cameron, though I think that he has got some significant issues as well. I think he's very politically flat-footed, and bizarrely, I think even Keir Starmer will be able to run rings around Rishi Sunak, which really says something. But even then, he's got that kind of that briefcase Toryism look. He looks good in a suit. He has tall person energy despite being very short. He is someone who would play well in the media. He's someone that would melt centrist hearts. Can imagine Guardian journalists going for it.
Despite the fact that until recently he secretly had a green card.
Yes,
and
it's totally bizarre.
Had his bags packed, ready to go off to Silicon Valley if things didn't work out here. So, yeah, despite that absolute illegitimacy, and we talk about Boris Johnson's role in the COVID response. Eat out to help out was Sunak's baby. This was a policy where there's a diversity of views on a lot of COVID containment measures in our audience, and we've taken quite a skeptical view historically on this show. But I will say that I don't think it was a good idea to give everybody vouchers for free meals if they went inside restaurants and sat down and ate in them. I mean, I was all for opening up, but specifically incentivizing everybody to go inside restaurants, and that was Rishi Sunak's idea. I mean, he's got us. Not that we'll hear about this if he ends up being the sort of the anointed successor in the media, but that guy is as responsible for as much chaos and as much complete idiocy over COVID as anybody in the government is. Absolute disaster.
Yeah. But also, Sunak has also been the architect of. He's been part and parcel of this whole Tories not offering anything or doing anything. One of my arguments has been that because the furlough scheme, well, firstly, Corbynism opened up political imagination in this country, which Boris Johnson was able to capitalise on with his ideas around the levelling up agenda. But one of the things that Sunak has pursued is since COVID came, and he brought in a furlough scheme, which, basically the state underwrote the wages bill in this country, and kept people at home, and benefits were temporarily uprated. Homelessness was solved overnight, virtually. All of these sorts of things, which opened up the political horizon even more. Since roundabout help out, eat out to help out, the health scheme, that he's been trying to kind of row back on that and row back on the state's ability to do things, to try and close down that political imagination again. And we've seen all kinds of absurd schemes that the Tories have come up with to try and kind of narrow down what is sometimes referred to as the Overton window. So, for example, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the leader of the House of Commons, Minister for Brexit Opportunities, and also has something to do with the civil service, he tabled a plan to cut the civil service by 90,000 people back to the level it was in 2016. This is in the middle of a crisis of state capacity where people can't get their passports, they can't get their driver's license sorted out. There's longer waits for benefits, all these kinds of things, and their solution is to exacerbate these problems by cutting the numbers of people that are working on them. Now, this only makes sense if you start seeing it through the filter of them engaged in a political project that is determined to drive down the political horizons and the political imagination of people. If people think the state can't do anything, they're not likely to put demands on the state, which is just suits the Tories fine.
Yeah. Your blog, A Very Public Sociologist.
All that is solid. A Very Public Sociologist is its URL.
Okay. All that is solid is the name. Okay. But you can find it with either name.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, you're a prolific blogger, and that is a resource that a lot of people go to for news on the Labour Party as well. As much as you're a scholar of the Conservative Party, I don't know if you're a Labour member now, but you've been very active in the party for a long time. How do you see this affecting the Labour Party? One argument that gets made is that Keir Starmer has completely constructed his identity as a leader as the anti-Boris Johnson, as this guy who is the kind of respectable face of the UK establishment and is the kind of great manager. He's represented himself as Boris's opposite. Now he doesn't have a Boris to oppose. How's that going to play?
Well, what's been interesting is seeing him pivot slightly in recent days. He started, since the beginning of this crisis that Boris Johnson has faced, which, for your American viewers, it started when Boris Johnson appointed an alleged sexual predator, as his deputy chief whip. that looks after discipline of the MPs in the House of Commons, in full knowledge of the allegations that were against this particular individual, and then Johnson lied about it and changed his story and lied about it. Since that broke, Keir Starmer's taken a different tack. Rather, it was all about Johnson and Boris Johnson being awful, being incompetent, and Tories being incompetent and awful. Now he's blamed all of the Conservative Party as being institutionally corrupt. He's coming out with the argument that it doesn't matter who is elected, the problem is the Conservative Party itself, rather than just Boris Johnson and a few bad apples, which is a big change in a big change in Starmer, because his criticisms historically have been quite muted. He's been very reticent to go on a full-scale critical barrage against the Tories. But again, I think one of the reasons this is Keir Starmer's leadership is one that is driven by public opinion and rather driven by what is encountered in the focus groups. So what the focus groups have been telling him, what public opinion has been telling the Labour Party, is that Starmer is a bit of a wet blanket. He's preferable to Johnson, but because he's not Boris Johnson, and not because of any kind of positive virtues that Keir Starmer might have. But also, obviously, these focus groups, and when you look at the polls as well, they're picking up on that anti-Tory feeling. And so now there is a big anti-Tory feeling. He's tailing it rather than leading it. You just have to go back a couple of years, for example, during the coronavirus, again, the acute phases of the coronavirus pandemic, and how he was offering so-called constructive criticisms. He was barely criticising the Tory party. He was talking about incompetence. He was talking a little bit about procurement issues, as if anyone really cares about procurement issues, and so on. So we've seen this phase, and so perhaps we're going to see a bit more politics from Starmer, because he realises that without Johnson being there, Labour's going to have to offer something. So maybe we'll start seeing some proper policy come through.
This is The Popular Show. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join us next week on Sublation Media. Also click through under the title to our own new YouTube channel. And we'd love to see you on Patreon as well in our little podcast community. I've got to thank Sean, NYCM, Aidan, Roberts, John, Steve, James Richardson, special friend of the show, Reese, EKB, George, Mac, and everybody else supporting us over there. We'd love to have you. Phil Burton-Cartledge's book, Falling Down, The Conservative Party and the Decline of Tory Britain, is published with Verso Books, and we strongly recommend it. Phil, thanks so much for joining us on The Popular Show.
Cheers.